Good day everyone, and again welcome to our fourth session in Introduction to the Philosophy of the Human Person. For today's lesson, we will be talking about fallacy. It is actually indicated and a continuation of our previous topic entitled Methods of Philosophizing. But beforehand, let us first define what do we mean by fallacy. Fallacy is defined as some of the usually committed errors in reasoning and thus coming up with false conclusion and worse, distorting the truth. It is generally understood, again, as a kind of error in reasoning. And take note, fallacy is always part of our arguments in our daily living. Hindi lang natin napapansin, but most of the time, we are committing fallacy. Logical fallacy is flaws in reasoning that lead to faulty, illogical statements. It is unreasonable argumentative tactics named for what has gone wrong during the reasoning process. Moreover, most logical fallacies masquerade as reasonable statements, but they are in fact attempts to manipulate readers by reaching their emotions instead of their intellects. Both deductive and inductive arguments can be fallacious. Some fallacious arguments are detectable by an examination of the form of the arguments. Hence, they are called formal fallacies. In other words, there are two types of fallacies. We have formal fallacies and we have informal fallacies. What is the difference between the two? When we say formal fallacies, like what I have said earlier, it gone through examination of the form of the argument. While on the other hand, informal fallacies can be detected by an examination of the content of the argument itself. And definitely, for our today's lesson, we will be dealing with informal fallacies. Alright, before we proceed with the different types of informal fallacies, let us again emphasize the difference between formal fallacy and informal fallacy. Formal fallacy refers to fallacious argument that can be detectable by an examination of the form of argument. In other words, ito ay tumutukoy sa maling pangangatwiran at struktura ng isang argumento, pahayag o sanaysay na siyang resulta o bunga ng isang formal na pag-aaral o pagsisiyasat. On the other hand, when we say informal fallacy, it is considered as some of fallacious argument that can be detected by an examination of the content of the argument itself. Sa madaling salita, pag sinabi nating informal fallacy, ito ay maling pangangatwiran na mapapansin sa mismong pangungusap, sanaysay o pahayag. In other words, ito ay maling pangangatwiran na matutukoy hindi sa pamamagitan ng formal na pag-aaral o pagsisiyasat na ginagawa sa formal fallacy, kundi sa halip sa mismong pangungusap, uulitin ko, sa mismong argumento, sa mismong pahayag, ay makikita natin na may mali sa pangangatwiran. Let us continue. Logicians have distinguished many types of informal fallacies. Although they have by no means agreed on uniform classifications, logicians have identified hundreds of types of fallacies. But here, I will only present 8 common types of informal fallacies. These include an appeal to pity, an appeal to ignorance, the fallacy of composition, the fallacy of division, an argument against the person, an appeal to force, false cause, and hasty generalization. Let us begin with appeal to pity, or also known as Argumentum ad misericordiam. It is described as a specific kind of appeal to emotion in which someone tries to win support for an argument or idea by exploiting his or her opponent's feelings of pity or guilt. It is a type of informal fallacy that arises when an appeal to evidence is replaced by an appeal to pity or mercy. The point here is that in making an argument, we are supposed to provide evidence or proofs to our claim or conclusion. But in an appeal to pity, as already pointed out, the arguer does not have the evidence or proofs for his claim. Hence, he is forced to invoke pity to win the sympathy of the listener. Let us consider the example. There is no question that what this young man did is intolerable and inconsistent or repugnant. He admits it himself, but you are not here to evaluate this man's conduct morally. You are here to try him and determine his guilt or innocence. And as you think this over, I want you to think hard about this young man, his home, and his future, which you now hold in your hands. Think about his broken home, never knowing his father, being left by his mother. Think about the poverty he has known, the foster homes, the birthdays go unnoticed, and the Christmas has never had. And think hard about the life in prison will do to him. Think about these things, and I know you will acquit him of this crime. As we can see in the example, the lawyer argues that his client should be acquitted because he is miserable and is a victim of an unfortunate life. However, even if it is true that indeed the accused is miserable and is a victim of an unfortunate life, it would be fallacious to conclude that the accused is not guilty or he should be acquitted simply because his life had been hard or because bringing in a verdict of guilty would add to his misery. For sure, the lawyer needs to provide strong proofs that would show that the accused has not committed the crime, for example, of a felony, before he may conclude that his client is not guilty. What have you noticed from the given example? Mas pinairal ang pagkaawa at pagkahabag upang hindi makulong ang suspect sa kanyang krimen, binalikan. Ano yung kanyang mga naging karanasan? Ang kanyang birthday ay lumipas ng hindi napansin. Ilang Pasko ang dumaan na hindi naging Pasko para sa kanya. Iniwan ng kanyang ina, iniwan ng kanyang ama, or hindi niya nakilala ang kanyang ama, walang sariling tahanan. So, mula sa example na yan, masasabi natin that it is an example of an appeal to pity. To further illustrate the fallacy of an appeal to pity, let us have another example that you may also relate with. I know my paper is late, Miss Rosille, but my mother was sick last night and I had to take care of her. Also, my father will not support my study anymore if I failed in your subject. So from the given premise, from the given argument, or from the given example itself, you may see that the author or the subject of that argument is asking for mercy, for compassion, is asking for pity so that he or she may able to pass his or her paper even though it is late. Okay? So ito yung kadalasan ninyong mga excuse, di ba? Kapag nagmamakaawa kayo sa teacher ninyo, nakikiusap, ma'am, kasi po ganito, kasi po ganoon, may nangyari po, and so on and so forth. At hindi natin napapansin, ito pala ay isang maling argumento or mali sa argument na meron tayo. Because we commit or we committed a fallacy of an appeal to pity. Next, appeal to ignorance, or also known as argumentum ad ignorantiam. Whatever has not been proved false must be true, and vice versa. Again, this type of informal fallacy that arises when an argument is taken as true because it has not proven to be false, or an argument is false because it has not proven to be true. Put differently, in an appeal to ignorance fallacy, the arguer claims that some statement P is true because someone failed to prove that P is false. Or statement P, on the other hand, is false because no one has proven that it is true. Hence, in each case, the lack of evidence or proof that P is true or false is used as a reason for concluding that P is true or false. The form of an appeal to ignorance fallacy looks like this. We do not know that P, which stands for situation or statement, is false, therefore P must be true. Or, we do not know that P is true, therefore P must be false. Let's consider the given example. Well, I have examined all the arguments for the existence of God, and I have seen that none of them proves that God exists. That's reason enough for me, there is no God. Another example. Since the class has no questions concerning the topics discussed in class, the class is ready for a test. In the given example, in the first example, the arguer concludes that there is no God because there are no successful proofs of God's existence. But the absence of a successful proof of God's existence does not justify the conclusion that there is no God. What the arguer is justified in the example is that we cannot know God. Next, we have the fallacy of composition. It is a type of informal fallacy which occurs when the arguer mistakenly concludes that something is true to the whole simply because it is true to some of the parts of the whole. Put differently, in the fallacy of composition, the arguer assumes that the truth of the part of the whole necessarily affects the truth of the whole. Hence, what is assumed to be true to the part of the whole is necessarily true to the whole. Let us consider the given example. De La Salle University is an excellent university. I know it because De La Salle's College of Nursing consistently tops the board exams for nursing. As we can see, the assumption of the argument in the given example is that what is true of the part, which is that is De La Salle University's College of Nursing, is true of the whole, that is the entire De La Salle University. However, it is obvious that the assumption is false. Why? Because the excellent performance of De La Salle's College of Nursing in the board exams for nursing does not necessarily imply that the De La Salle University is an excellent institution of higher learning. It might be the case that De La Salle's College of Engineering performs very poorly in the board exams of engineering. To illustrate further the fallacy of composition, let us have another example. The pink sweater is gorgeous. The purple skirt over there is smashing. I love those red shoes in the window. And how about that terrific yellow vest on the mannequin? Let us face it, it will make a great outfit for you. So kung mapapansin ninyo, uulitin ko po, sa fallacy of composition, napapansin natin na may mali sapagkat yung bahagi lamang ng statement, bahagi lang ng isang senaryo ay nakakaapekto sa kabuuan ng pangyayari ng statement or ng isang sitwasyon. Again, that is the fallacy of composition. Let us now have the opposite of the fallacy of composition, which is known as the fallacy of division. It is also known as false deduction. It is a type of informal fallacy which occurs when the arguer mistakenly concludes that something is true to one or some of the parts of the whole, simply because it is true of the whole. As we can see, the fallacy of division is the opposite of the fallacy of composition. As we may already know, the fallacy of composition is committed when the arguer erroneously assumes that something is true to the whole simply because it is true to some of the parts of the whole. So, paglilinaw lang po yun, ha? Then, let us consider the given example. One of the causes of poverty is laziness. Since 80% of the Filipino people are poor, then it can be logically argued that the Filipino people are lazy. As we can see in the example, the specific characteristic of the group as a whole, that is the laziness of the Filipino people, is mistakenly attributed to all the members of the group. That is, the Filipino people are lazy. As the example illustrates, many Filipinos may have the characteristic of being lazy, which may be one of the causes of poverty. However, it is not safe to assume that the characteristic of being lazy is possessed by all the Filipino people taken individually. Thus, again, what is true of the whole is not necessarily true of the parts. Another example, the United States is the richest country in the world. Therefore, everyone in the United States must be rich and live well. Again and again, in the fallacy of division, we may see that what is true of the whole is not necessarily true of the parts. Let us have another fallacy, which is known as against the person, or Argumentum ad hominem. This fallacy is a type of informal fallacy that arises when the arguer ignores the real claims or issues in the argument, so that what is emphasized is the character, personality, or belief of the opponent. In other words, in the argument against the man or the human person, the arguer attacks the person rather than the person's ideas or insights in order to drive his point. Let us consider the given example. You, Honor, it is impossible for us not to believe that the accused of this murder case is not guilty because his father and grandfather had been convicted of murder several years ago. And besides, the accused is of bad moral reputation. As we can see, the arguer in the example attacks the personality of the accused instead of providing the proofs of evidence that indeed it is the accused has committed the crime. For sure, we cannot say that the accused is guilty of the crime of murder simply because he is of bad moral reputation or his father and grandfather had been convicted of murder several years ago. Again, the arguer needs to show the proofs in order to say that the accused is guilty of the crime of murder. Let us have another example. Don't listen to Eddie's arguments on education. He's an idiot. So kung titingnan natin, in the fallacy of against the person, ang tinitira, ang tinitingnan ay hindi kung ano ang sitwasyon, ano ang argument, ano ang statement, ano ang sitwasyon, but rather ano ang pinagdaanan, ano ang katangian at personalidad ng taong subject sa isang krimen or ng taong pinag-uusapan. Kaya nga dun sa ating example, anong sabi dyan? Maaari or sigurado na yung ating subject ay guilty sa pagpatay. Bakit? Sapagkat ang kanyang ama at ang kanyang lolo ay mismong nakulong din daang taon na or ilang taon na ang nakaraan dahil sa pagpatay. Okay? So again, that is a fallacy against the person. At kadalasan din, ito ay ginagamit natin laban sa ating kapwa. Diba? Kapag tayo humuhusga at nagbibigay ng puna, sa halip na ang tingnan natin ay yung pagkakakilanlan ng isang tao, yung kanyang ideya or yung kanyang pananaw sa buhay, mas tinitingnan natin yung uri ng pagkatao na mayroon siya. At ito, mulit-muli, ang fallacy against the person. Next, we have the fallacy which is known as appeal to force, or also known as argumentum ad baculum. An appeal to force is a type of informal fallacy that arises when the arguer, instead of showing the evidence, appeals to intimidation or use force to gain acceptance of his or her argument. In other words, the appeal to force fallacy happens when the arguer tries to persuade the other or the listener by pointing out his or her power over the other or warning the other of the bad consequences if he or she refuses to accept his or her argument. To illustrate it further, let us have an example or examples. College dean to a teacher, you better think twice before giving that student a failing grade. Remember, he is the nephew of the university president. From that example, we may analyze that we can notice that the arguer possesses a threat to the listener, saying in effect, accept my conclusion or you will be sorry. As we can obviously see, the fact that the arguer intimidates or possesses a threat to the listener does not make her conclusion true. Another example, father to a daughter, you should study nursing, otherwise, I will not send you to college. So in other words, itong appeal to force na ito, may pananakot. Whether you like it or not, you have to accept my conclusion. You have to accept my suggestion. Or even you have to accept my comments. Or else, you will be sorry for that. And in that sense, we may see that there's something wrong in the arguments, that there's something wrong in the given conclusion or in the formulated conclusion, because that arises from the force. Okay? Then, another example, it is a conversation between Jordan and his dad. Jordan says, Dad, why do I have to spend my summer at Jesus' camp? Then his dad answered, because if you don't, you will spend your entire summer in your room with nothing but your Bible. So, in another sense, we may say and we may see that it left us no choice. Then, we have another type of fallacy known as false cause or post hoc. This fallacy is a type of informal fallacy that arises when one assigns as the cause those facts that merely preceded or accompanied the effect when in fact there is no good evidence of a logical connection or causal relation. Hence, an arguer commits the fallacy of false cause when he or she labels something as the cause of something else on the basis of insufficient or unrepresentative evidence. To understand it better, let us have our example. Statistics show that nearly every heroin user started by using marijuana. It is reasonable to conclude then that marijuana leads to the harder drug. As we can see in the example, the arguer claims that the majority of the heroin users tried marijuana before using heroin. This might be true, however, the arguer concludes that smoking marijuana will necessarily lead to the use of harder drugs, such as heroin. The conclusion is obviously illogical or fallacious. Why? Because there is no strong proof or evidence that the use of marijuana will necessarily lead to the use of harder drugs. Let us have another example. Last night, I was so angry at my brother that I wish he was dead, and now he is in the hospital. God, if only I had not thought that. It is all my fault. I will never feel hatred again, not of everyone. If we will analyze the example, it is clear that it is fallacious argument. Even though the person in the example simply regrets having had ill feelings toward his brother, we cannot logically conclude that his act of wishing his brother dead is the cause of his brother getting sick. Instead, or indeed, there is no good reason to believe in this case that wishing it so has caused it to be so. O, para mas maging maliwanag, gumamit tayo ng lingwaheng Filipino. Okay? Ang false cause ay isang maling argumento, sanaysay or pahayag na tumutukoy, halimbawa, magbigay tayo ng halimbawa. Ito yung, halimbawa, may bago akong tsinelas. O, sinuot ko ito. Ngayon, pagkasuot mo, biglang umulan. O, anong statement mo? Sasabihin mo, ay nako, hindi ko na pala ulit ito isusuot kasi tuwing isinusuot ko ito ay umuulan. So, why it is considered as fallacious argument? Simply because there is no proof there is no evidence that the cause of the rain is wearing your new slippers. Okay? Gets po? Again, that is the fallacy of false cause. Then, we have hasty generalization. This is last fallacy among the 8 fallacies that I am talking about. Hasty generalization occurs when a generalization is formed on the basis of an unrepresentative sample. As we may already know, to be accurate, a generalization about a group should be based upon a sample that reflects the diversity of that group. One way of ensuring a representative sample, in some cases, is to select as large a sample as possible. The more people polled, for example, the more likely it is that the results truly represent the group. However, an accurate generalization does not necessarily require a large sample. In Gallup opinion polls, generalizations are typically based on surveys of a very small number of people. However, the pollsters are careful to select a typical or representative group of people for their sample. Let us have examples. You visit a new country and the first person you meet in the airport is rude. You send a message to a friend back home that everyone in this new country is rude. So from that given example, we may see that from a very specific situation, you made a general conclusion. Okay? Another example, Christine has a terrible experience with a boyfriend. She decides that all boys are mean. So bakit ito mali? Katulad ng sinabi ko, from a specific scenario, from a specific situations, you made a general conclusion. Okay? Kasi dun sa example number 1 natin, anong sinasabi? Nakakilala ka ng isang rude na tao sa airport. And from that, ano nang sinabi mo pag uwi mo dun sa lugar ninyo? Na lahat ng tao doon sa bansang pinuntahan mo, na binisita mo, ay ang tao lahat ay rude. So may mali because you made a generalization from a very specific fact or from a very specific situation or scenario. Again, those are the common types of informal fallacies that may distort the truth. Appeal to pity, appeal to ignorance, fallacy of composition, fallacy of division, against the person, appeal to force, false cause, and hasty generalization. Let us now proceed to the nature of knowledge. This lesson will discuss the process of acquiring and apprehending concepts, including the stages in the development of a concept for knowledge to be possible. It will also discuss the nature of concepts and the difference between sentences and statements. The element of when truth or falsity would come in will also be tackled. Together with this comes a discussion about the different types of meaningful statements as well as the different types of knowledge. Let us now proceed. There are actually 3 major stages in the apprehension of a concept before knowledge becomes possible. These are perception, abstraction, and judgment. Perception is actually the first stage, which involves an activity that does not make us different from animals. Animals also perceive their surroundings, including the things around them. There are 2 types of perception, the external perception and the internal perception. External perception happens when we perceive things using our 5 senses. The result of the process of external perception is called percept. Consequently, once you use any and all of your five senses to perceive the world, you have these percepts. For instance, when you perceive a chair, you have the percept of a chair. When you perceive a glass of water, definitely you will have the percept of a glass of water. Percepts are the immediate product of external perception. On the other hand, internal perception happens when you use your imagination and memory. And from these percepts, you could close your eyes and use your imagination and memory to recreate the percept into an image or what we call phantasm, which is actually called or known as the product of the process of imagination or internal perception. So, maliwanag po ba ano ang pinagkaiba ng external perception at ano ang pinagkaiba ng internal perception? Ulitin lang natin, balikan natin. Ang external perception ay gumagamit ng five senses. Ano-ano yung senses na yon? Sense of touch, sense of taste, sense of smell, and so on and so forth. So, sa paggamit daw ng five senses na ito, sa pagtingin, pagbibigay ng sarili mong pananaw or paano mo tinitingnan ang lahat ng nasa paligid mo, ang ginagamit natin ay external perception. At ano ang produkto, ano ang resulta kapag ginagawa natin ito? Ang tawag doon ay precepts. Sa kabilang banda naman, ang internal perception naman ay nagaganap o nangyayari kapag gumagamit tayo ng ating pag-iisip at ng ating imahinasyon. At sa pamamagitan ng paggamit ng imahinasyon at ng ating memorya, nakakabuo tayo ng imahe or yung tinatawag nating phantasm. Abstraction. Abstraction is the second stage that distinguishes us from animals. This process was described by Charles Coppens, S.J., as a simple apprehension or conception, meaning simple apprehension is the act of perceiving the object intellectually without affirming or denying anything concerning it. To apprehend is to take hold of the thing as if with the hand. An apprehension is an act of the mind. It is an intellectual grasping of an object. So ano pong ibig sabihin nito? According to Charles Coppens, ang abstraction ay kilala din sa tawag na simple apprehension or conception. It is going beyond or it goes beyond imagination. Bakit? Kasi sa stage ng abstraction or simple apprehension or conception, ipinagpapalagay mo na ang isang bagay ay nasa sa iyong kamay, nahahawakan, kung kaya't nakikita mo ano ang katangian, ano ang kakanyahan, ano ang pagkakakilanlan ng isang bagay na nasa sa iyong kamay. Kumbaga parang nasasalat mo. Thus, it involves the use of the intellect where we grasp what is universal among the different particulars that we have observed from perception. For example, you would be able to abstract what is universal or essential for something to be called a chair. Upon perceiving different kinds of chairs in the world, you would be able to grasp through the process of simple apprehension the concept of a chair. You would now be able to apply this concept of a chair and identify other chairs that you would see in the future. Anong ibig sabihin nito? Sa halimbawang ibinigay, bagamat ikaw ay makakita ng iba't ibang uri ng upuan, yung unang persepsyon, yung unang apprehension at pagbibigay kahulugan mo at pagkilala at pagkakakita mo sa pagkakakilanlan at kakanyahan ng upuan na ito, kahit papagsama-samahin ng mga upuan na yan at the end, you could consider and you could recognize what are the characteristics of a chair for the chair to be called as a chair. Sa wikang Filipino, para hindi kayo malito, paano natatawag ang isang upuan na upuan? Anong ginagamit nito? Anong ginagamit natin dito? Not just a perception, but rather abstraction. Kasi ipinapalagay mo na yung upuan na yun ay nasa sa iyong kamay, sinasalat mo ano ang mga katangian ng upuan na ito para siya ay matawag na isang upuan. Para kung magkaganon man na ang upuan na ito ay mapasama sa bilang ng iba pang mga upuan, you have the concept of what we call chair. Thus, the results of this process of abstraction, also known as simple apprehension or conception, are considered as concepts. From the precepts and images, you were able to arrive at the concepts using your intellect. Kaya nga, in the process of abstraction, nagkakaroon ka ngayon ng konsepto. What is your concept about love? What is your concept about freedom? What is your concept about justice? You are now able to establish and to build the different concepts that you have in your mind. And in this process, you are using your intellects. And again, that concepts are considered as the building blocks of knowledge. Thus, it is the mind or the intellect that is responsible for the formation of concepts. Again, concepts exist in the mind. We perceive only particulars in the world. Our mind has the capacity for constructing concepts as general terms like your concept of a chair, or even abstract concepts like love, beauty, justice, peace, and so on and so forth. So, in abstract terms, the mere auditory percept of these abstract concepts enables one to directly form the concept without having to go through internal perception and its corresponding imagery or phantasm. Again, the process is not yet complete. Why? Sabi natin, for the knowledge to be possible, kinakailangan dumaan dun sa 3 stages. So, we are done with perception. Nakita mo, nagkaroon ka ng sarili mong pananaw gamit ang iyong senses. Or, pwede din gamit ang iyong memory, gamit ang iyong imagination sa external perception. And then, we have also this process of abstraction or simple apprehension, kung saan ipinagpapalagay mo na talagang nahahawakan mo, nakikita mo, at nakakabuo ka ng konsepto tungkol sa mga bagay-bagay. The third stage is considered as judgment. Taking at least 2 concepts and putting them together to make a statement or a proposition that could either be true or false about the world. And the process of that is the result of that or the product of that is no other than proposition or statement. Ulitin natin. Nakita mo, naramdaman mo, napakinggan mo, naamoy mo, perception. Inisip mo, perception. Nakabuo ka ng pagkakakilanlan as if you are holding the thing, the scenario or the situation at your hand, apprehension and abstraction. Meron kang sariling konsepto. And the last stage, for the knowledge to be possible, you have to make your judgment. And your judgment will be true or will be false depends upon how you are going to put together the concepts na nabuo mo. And from that concepts, you would be able to make a statement and a proposition, which is actually the product of this judgment. Okay? So again, these are the 3 stages for the knowledge to be possible. Sentences and statements. In logic, the term statement is variously understood to mean either a meaningful declarative sentence that is true or false, or the assertion that is made by a true or false declarative sentence. What does it mean? We are familiar with the 5 types of sentences, namely, the declarative sentence, which is meant to express a statement, interrogative sentence, which is meant to ask a question, imperative sentence, which is meant to issue or to give a command, expletive sentence, which is meant to issue a wish, and exclamatory, which is meant to express surprise. Sentences have no truth value. They are merely uttered as the verbal means of communicating or expressing commands, questions, emotions like surprise or pleasures, and wishes. A statement is distinct from a sentence in that a sentence is only one formulation of a statement. In conclusion, all statements can be considered as sentences, but not all sentences are made to be statements. It is the statement expressed through a declarative sentence has the element of truth or falsity. Since there is a knowledge claim or an assertion being made in a statement, sentences in their simpler form are merely uttered. Therefore, they have no truth value. Ibig sabihin, among those different types of sentences that we have, ang mayroon lamang pong elemento ng katotohanan or kasinungalingan ay walang iba kundi ang declarative sentence. Bakit? Halimbawa, nagtanong ka, what time is it? Tatanungin mo pa ba whether the statement or whether that sentence is true or false? Definitely not. When you say or when you have an expression at sinabi mong, ouch, ang sakit, aray, ano ba yan, ang sakit? Tatanungin mo pa ba, totoo ba ang kanyang sinasabi or hindi? Siya ba'y nagsasabi ng totoo or hindi? And so on and so forth. There are 2 types of statements, the analytic and empirical statements. Analytic statements states that the truth or falsity of the knowledge claim being made by an analytic statement could be found within the statement itself. In other words, you do not have to go outside the statement to search whether the claim is true or false. When somebody claims that a bachelor is an unmarried male of marriageable age, one does not have to go outside of the statement to check for its truth or falsity. Why? Because one would know right away that the statement is true upon examination of the key terms contained within the statement, because the statement given is actually a definition of a bachelor. O, paglilinaw, pag sinabi daw nating analytic statement, hindi na kinakailangan pang magtungo sa labas para lamang siyasatin at tukuyin kung ang pangungusap ba or ang pahayag ba ay tama. Bakit? Sa simpleng pagtingin mo pa lang sa composition ng mga salitang ginamit or even the specific term na ginamit sa isang pahayag ay maa-identify mo na, matutukoy mo na whether the statement is true or false. From the given example that a bachelor is an unmarried male of marriageable age, hindi na natin kailangan pang mag-Google. Hindi na natin kailangan pang gumamit ng anumang references para lamang mapatunayan kung tama ba o mali ang statement. Bakit? Because the statement itself tells or speaks about what is meant by bachelor. Kasi ito yung kahulugan mismo ng bachelor, isang matandang lalaki na hindi nakapag-asawa. Definitely, that is unmarried male of marriageable age. Definitely, again, that could be considered as analytic statement. On the other hand, we have empirical statements. The truth or falsity depend on the state of affairs being claimed. What does it mean? Empirical statements adhere that the knowledge claim being made is not dependent on the definition or tautologous statements whose truths are contained within itself. It is the exact opposite of what we meant by analytic statement. But the truth or falsity being claimed by an empirical statement rests on its correspondence with facts or with the current state of affairs being claimed. Thus, the earlier statement that we have, the sky is blue, is an empirical statement whose truth depends on the additional information or claim being made. Its truth or falsity would now depend on whether or not the state of affairs being described actually obtains at the moment. Moreover, the denial in empirical statement would not lead to absurdity and contradiction, but rather the denial of the statement, the kitten is not on the mat, will not be absorbed on the contradictory because the state of affairs being described is one of the possibilities or contingencies happening in the empirical world. In other words, you are not appealing to definitions in making a claim, but rather you are adding contingent information in the world about the kitten. Furthermore, you will not be able to discover the truth of the statement by mere analysis of the key terms contained therein. You have to go outside of the statement and to look and see whether the state of affairs being claimed actually corresponds with the empirical world. So, katulad ng sinabi natin, it is the exact opposite of analytic statements. Kung sa analytic statements, tingnan mo lang yung mga terminologies, the structures, and the formation of the sentences or the statements, you may be able to find out ito ba ay totoo or hindi. Pero sa empirical statements, you need to go beyond. You need to go outside the structure and the formation of the statements. But rather, you have to seek, you have to search so that you may be able to identify whether the statement is true or false. So, katulad ng halimbawa na ibinigay, the kitten is on the mat. So, from that example, hindi mo pwedeng sabihin kaagad na true. Hindi mo pwedeng sabihin kaagad na false. Teka muna, alin bang kitten yon? Alin bang pusa yon? Alin bang kuting yon? So, you have to go outside the construction, the structure, the formation, or even the terminologies used in the statement in order for you to find out whether that statement is true or false. Nakukuha po. Kailangan mong tingnan. Yun ba yung nasa may pinto na kuting? Then, kapag tiningnan mo at ang pusa nga ay nasa ibabaw nung doormat na nandoon sa may pintuan, definitely that statement is true. And that is what we call empirical statements. It goes beyond the sentence structure, the sentence pattern, or even the formation of the statement itself in order for you to find out whether the statement is true or false. Now, we have the different types of knowledge. First, the formal knowledge. It corresponds to knowledge in the formal sciences whose main concern is the validation of their knowledge claims within the formal system in their respective disciplines. This could be logical, mathematical, linguistic, or any formal system whose method of validation depends entirely on the particular system being used. The formal sciences is characterized by the consistency of the system being used. Therefore, they are not dependent on the accumulation of empirical data, but they are concerned with the structure or validity of their sciences within the formal deductive framework that governs them. On the other hand, we have empirical knowledge, which is the general term used to describe the different disciplines in the empirical sciences, ranging from the hard sciences of physics, chemistry, biology, and others to the soft sciences of sociology, political science, psychology, and others. Inasmuch as empirical statements use the faculty of experience and sense perception in order to establish their knowledge claims, empirical knowledge also takes emphasis and makes use of the data or the content from the experience and its correspondence with the state of affairs to establish the truth or falsity of their knowledge claims from these empirical sciences. The empirical sciences give information about what the world is. So again, these are the two types of knowledge. Let us now have knowledge and truth. Under knowledge and truth, we have the theories of truth, particularly the Coherence Theory, the Correspondence Theory, and the Pragmatic Theory. Coherence Theory of truth deals with the consistency of the truth of statements being claimed within the system that is being used or employed. In other words, it states that the truth of any true proposition consists in its coherence with some specified set of propositions or significant wholes. This means that the truth condition of a proposition are based on other propositions as opposed to the correspondence theory of truth, where the truth conditions are based on facts or objective features of the world. In simpler terms, the coherence theory of truth insists that a belief is true if and only if it is part of a coherent system of beliefs. Let us have an example. The sum of half of 6 and 10 is 13. Why? Because the given mathematical equation is true by virtue of the coherence theory of truth, because the system of belief is coherent with it. That is the answer. 13 is arrived at and recognized as coherent in connection with other several contents of arithmetic, where the rules of addition and multiplication of fractions are acceptable operations. Sa madaling salita, pag sinabi nating coherence theory, it is mathematically or scientifically or philosophically explained well. Okay? So halimbawa, 3 plus 3 equals 6. The statement is correct, definitely, because in the rule of mathematics or in the rule of addition, 3 plus 3 is actually equivalent to 6. So, meron siyang pamantayan. Meron siyang pinanunundan. Okay? Kaya masasabi natin that the statement is actually correct. In other words, the coherence theory of truth has to do with the well-formed formulas adopted in the field of the formal sciences like mathematics, logic, trigonometry, geometry, or linguistic systems where definitions are considered as tautologies. And these well-formed formulas have been accepted as universal and have been proven to be true within the assumptions or axioms of the system where they belong. Next, correspondence theory. Correspondence theory of truth states that the key to truth is the relation or correspondence between propositions and the world. This means that a belief is true if there exists an appropriate entity, a fact to which it corresponds. If there is no such entity, the belief is false. Let us have an example. There is a water fountain in front of the cultural center of the Philippines. The correspondence theory of truth compares the given proposition and the truth conditions or state of affairs that will make the proposition true. Para daw masabi yung proposition, yung statement natin na totoo. Ano nga po ulit yung statement natin? There is a water fountain in front of the cultural center of the Philippines. Under correspondence theory of truth, we have to consider different things. First, there is such a thing as a water fountain. Meron ba talagang bagay na kung tawagin ay water fountain? Ikalawa, is there a place called Cultural Center of the Philippines? Meron ba talagang lugar na kung tawagin ay Cultural Center of the Philippines? And third, is the water fountain is in front of the Cultural Center of the Philippines. In other words, sa correspondence theory, ang mahalaga dito yung actual, yung practical na nakikita ng ating mga mata, na ginagamitan natin ng ating senses. Kaya nga, it would have sense perception or experience as its source of knowledge. In other words, perception becomes the basis for verifying something as true or false about the world. So another example, pag sinabi mo na ang bata ay nadapa, definitely, in order to find out whether ang bata ay talagang nadapa, we have to take a look. May bata ba talaga? Ano ang posisyon ng bata? Saan ito nadapa? That is correspondence theory. The third is pragmatic theory. It is tantamount to the good or practical consequences that the belief in the idea would bring. It holds that a proposition is true if it is useful to believe or to believe it. Okay? So, for example, a dream board is necessary for dreams to come true. Do you think that statement is true or false? So, under the pragmatic theory of truth, the given statement or proposition is true if it leads to success. That is, if it is expedient for the person to believe that his or her dreams will come true with visualization. If, on the other hand, people believe that visualization is unnecessary for achieving a dream or goal, then it will not be expedient to create a dream board. And therefore, the given proposition will be considered false. Let us have another example. Our belief about Santa Claus. Diba? Bata pa lang tayo, naniniwala na tayo kung na meron talagang Santa Claus. So, under pragmatic theory, anong sinasabi dito? If the proposition, the idea, the insight, or the belief will be useful for you to become a better person, necessarily, the statement is correct. Kung itong statement na ito na si Santa Claus ay totoo para sa'yo, or si Santa Claus ay naging inspirasyon mo para isabuhay mo yung kagandahang loob ng pagbibigayan tuwing araw ng Pasko, definitely, under pragmatic theory, the statement that Santa Claus is real is true. Pero kung ito ay walang magandang naidudulot sa'yo at nagising ka sa kasinungalingan at ito ang nag-udyok at nagtulak din sa'yo para manloko ka ng kapwa, definitely, that idea of Santa Claus becomes false. Again, that falls under Pragmatic Theory. Okay? And to add some, according to William James, the truth of an idea is not a stagnant property inherent in it. Rather, truth happens to an idea. Now, let us have the sources of knowledge. We have the faculty of reason, faculty of experience or sense of perception, and the faculty of intuition. So whenever we will be talking about sources of knowledge, ito yung pinanggagalingan. Saan ba nanggagaling yung kaalaman? Okay? Faculty of reason. It is construed as an analytic faculty that is able to determine the truth of analytic statements. Then, faculty of experience has something to do with the use of the five senses, including sensory extending devices for the purposes of verifying our empirical claims and thus leading to empirical knowledge. And the last one, our faculty of intuition, which deals with the immediate or direct recognition of self-evident truths. That ends our lesson. And again, thank you very much and have a blessed day ahead.